One of the most interesting figures in American politics is Republican strategist and pollster Frank Luntz. Now, in recent history, the left-wing media has essentially villainized Frank Luntz as some kind of sinister actor that tricks people into voting against their own self-interest, as if his job is unique to the Republican Party, and the left wing does not have the exact same Frank Luntz equivalents working for them. You see, what Frank Luntz does, and he's actually among the best at doing this, is poll test different verbiage in order to help the GOP sell their policies. He's credited for introducing a ton of phrases into the American political lexicon, and because Frank Luntz is like the best of the best at what he does, his phrases are nearly almost always universally adopted by the Republican Party. If you guys remember during the Obama administration when we were talking about tax rates on the wealthy, all of a sudden the GOP in lockstep started saying job creators as a method to describe the wealthy. That's a Frank Luntz phrase, among many, many more Frank Luntz phrases. Now, there are people just like Frank Luntz that do the exact same job as Frank Luntz on the left, and I'd argue that historically, the people on the left have been far more convincing and far more effective than Frank Luntz has. For instance, if you have a superficial understanding of American politics, you've probably heard the phrase trickle-down economics as a method to describe the Republican theory of economics. But here's the thing. Trickle-down economics is not an economic theory. It has never once in the history of the world been proposed by a Republican or conservative economist, or any economist for that matter. Trickle-down economics is a 100-plus-year-old phrase that has been used consistently by people on the left to attack people that advocate for lower taxes. It's not an economic theory, and one of the reasons you know it's not an economic theory, besides the fact that no economist ever proposed this, is because it doesn't make any sense on its face. The proposed goal of the theory put forward by left-wingers that are always attacking this non-existent theory is that the Republicans say that they're trying to help the poor by giving tax cuts to the rich so that money will trickle down to the poor. But if the goal was to give money to poor people, why wouldn't they just give money directly to poor people? Obviously, this is not a real theory. This is just a made-up phrase used to attack Republican economic theories, specifically supply-side economics. And in fact, this propaganda term is so effective that there are going to be a ton of people in the comments saying that supply-side economics is the exact same theory as trickle-down economics, even though the phrase trickle-down economics predates supply-side by decades. And in fact, the left-wing versions of Frank Luntz have been so effective for over a century in disparaging these kind of economic theories that you can actually hear Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney using the term trickle-down economics to describe his own economic program, despite the fact that it's literally a straw man and a pejorative against programs that he's trying to offer. Now, the reason I'm bringing all this up to open this video is that it's important to understand that opinion of the public is incredibly malleable, and sometimes when people in the public are saying yes or no to certain things, that doesn't tell the whole story, and you actually have to dive way deeper into the polling numbers in order to understand what people actually support and what they're actually against. And even though it's become common parlance in American politics to villainize strategists like Frank Luntz, the fact of the matter is that these people are just more knowledgeable about how public opinion works than the average pundit that you see on air or online. And a perfect example of somebody completely lacking knowledge in the online arena is Kyle Kulinski and the way that he talks about public opinion polls.
Politics is an easy game that we make difficult. All those overpaid Democratic strategists in Washington, D.C., they're useless. So we have the answers. Now it's just time to implement them and fight for them and be unapologetic on that front. And if you do that, the Republicans will be in a permanent minority from now until the end of time. So, there is a lot of good news in this election, just so you know. Even with the Super Tuesday results, which, we weren't ecstatic about, but there's still data points that show that we're winning the war. We're winning the long-term fight. So, every single contest where there was a vote, except for Arkansas and Utah, they did entrance polls or exit polls. And so you get a sense of where people are on the issues. In every single place, Medicare for all was above water.
Now, in my last video, I showed quite clearly that Kyle Kulinski and most of the online progressive media's reading of the Medicare for all opinion polls was wholly inaccurate. Now, during that video, I referenced the Kaiser polling, and I used a good boil down of the Kaiser polling put out by MarketWatch. However, this created a lot of confusion among people, so today we're going to skip over the boil down article, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean with the Kaiser polling data itself, so that you can understand that the article was a good boil down of the data, and Kyle Kulinski's version of the data that he's presenting to his audience, that he's been presenting to his audience, is nowhere near accurate. Now, the reason I used, and I will still be using, polling data from the Kaiser Family Foundation on Medicare for All is because they've been polling this issue for decades, and they've been consistently polling this issue throughout the 2020 Democratic primary, and even before then. And on top of that, this is the exact polling data that nearly a year ago, all of the progressive media decided to cite as their source for the fact that the American people overwhelmingly support Medicare for all.
New poll out from the Kaiser Family Foundation on healthcare, and as expected, it's good news for the left. So they phrased this in a variety of different ways. They basically asked people what they think of universal healthcare, and they phrased it in a variety of different ways. And obviously the terminology makes a big difference, and it can make people respond positively or negatively. So let's go right to the elephant in the room here. When it's framed as Medicare for all, 62% of the American people have a positive view of Medicare for all.
On top of that, there are incredibly silly accusations coming from people like Kyle Kulinski and others in the far left media that say that the entrance and exit polling question on Medicare for all was somehow unfair and uncharitable to the Bernie Sanders side of that issue. That is completely ridiculous, and when you understand the totality of the polling on this issue, you'll understand that the phrasing of that question is the most fair humanly possible that you can do based on asking just one question on the Medicare for all issue. It actually cuts unfairly against Joe Biden because it's a solo question put on there without the additional follow-ups that get people to qualify their position.
And again, remember, the way that they're asking the question is biased to try to get people to say, I don't want it. Because they say, do you want to replace private health insurance and, put into place a single government, plan or whatever? It's phrased in some way like that, which was not the best way to talk about it. If they asked about, do you support Medicare for all, the numbers would be even more on Bernie's side.
So what we have here is polling from the Kaiser Family Foundation as it relates to Medicare for all or national health care. And as you can see, the favored numbers have actually been north of 50%, at least dating back to June of 2017. And throughout the campaign, even though they take hits here and there, they've been pretty solid, the favor to oppose numbers, solid in favor of a generic response to a national healthcare plan or Medicare for all. I believe that the way that they ask this question a lot of the times is if you favor a national healthcare plan or oppose it, that is sometimes referred to as Medicare for all. See right here, sometimes called Medicare for all. Now, as you can see, there's going to be a divide amongst the partisans. As you can see, the Republicans are more strongly opposed to it, while the Democrats are more strongly in favor of it. Independents are in between, about the same, strongly opposed and strongly in favor. However, I will point out that the Democrats are only 44% strongly in favor of a Medicare for all system, while the Republicans' opposition to it is much higher. This was the messaging part of it that I referred to previously in my video. As you can see, telling people that there are going to be delays in their system really hurt the approval and disapproval. You get to 70% disapproval if you tell them that there's going to be delays. If you threaten the current Medicare system, that goes to 60% disapproval. Require most Americans to pay higher taxes, 60% disapproval. Eliminate private healthcare insurance, that's 58% disapproval. However, if you tell people that you're going to reduce or replace all the costs that are out of pocket, which is something that Bernie Sanders says a lot, it goes up the approval to 67%, and guaranteeing health insurance as a right gets the approval all the way up to 71%. This is why the attacks all come from here, and the promotional material put forward by the Sanders campaign emphasizes this more than anything else. Now, this is where we get into major problems, because it turns out that most people don't know that you're going to lose your private insurance under a Medicare for all system. In fact, 55% of the people think that the opposite is true.
And again, remember, the way that they're asking the question is biased to try to get people to say, I don't want it. Because they say, do you want to replace private health insurance and, put into place a single government, plan or whatever? It's phrased in some way like that, which was not the best way to talk about it. If they asked about, do you support Medicare for all, the numbers would be even more on Bernie's side.
Now, by the way, this portion of the chart alone should answer fully whether or not the question was unfair to the Bernie Sanders types. Only 37% of the people, when asked directly whether or not they believe that Medicare for all will abolish private insurance, gave the correct answer. But even worse than that, 67% of the people who support Medicare for all are under the impression that it does not abolish private insurance and they would be able to keep their private insurance after Medicare for all passes. So when the polling indicates that the majority of people, when asked a question related to Medicare for all, cannot tell you a basic thing about Medicare for all, it would indicate that asking just a Medicare for all question isn't accurate. But worse than that, it turns out that ignorance of the program strongly correlates with support of the program. While 55% of the general population can't tell you that Medicare for all actually abolishes private insurance, 67% of the people who support it are under the impression that it would allow them to keep their private insurance. So you have to ask the question in such a way to cut through this disconnect between Medicare for all's name and the actual basic tenets of the program. So yes, Kyle is 100% wrong about this question being unfairly biased against progressives, when in reality, it's closer to neutral, but still biased against reality because it doesn't give people the full totality of the issue that the in-depth polling does.
I would say to Bernie's campaign is you still have to hammer away on electability. We're the only one who can beat Trump. We're the only one who can beat Trump. We're the only one who can beat Trump. Because you won in terms of policies. And the other thing I would do is, again, keep framing the discussion as I'm the moderate, I'm the centrist, Biden is the extremist. And the argument you use is the one I've been using every day, which is according to every poll, I represent the center of mainstream American opinion. So that's centrism right there. That's what that is.
You see, there's this delusion perpetuated by people on the far left that Medicare for all is not only the centrist position within the Democratic Party, but it's actually the centrist position in the entire country, and all of our politicians, except for Bernie Sanders, are dramatically far right. That is not the case. It's not even the centrist position in the Democratic Party. Look at the polling data. It's all in there. Stop skimming over the data for what you want to see and take it all in its totality. When asked in a one-to-one comparison if people prefer building on the ACA, which is Obamacare, the overwhelming majority of the Democratic Party chooses building on Obamacare rather than switching to a Medicare for all system. And if you still somehow believe that Bernie Sanders is the center of the country, look at this question. Look at what they're asking here. This is essentially a public option question. If you can see, the majority of Americans, not just Democrats, 77%, support letting people from 50 to 64 buy into the Medicare program. And on top of that, people who can't get their insurance from work or from somewhere else, 75% support letting them buy into Medicaid. This is the public option. This is where the country is at right now. They are not in a Medicare for all system. You saw that in the previous polls. It's devastating for the Sanders types, and it shows that Joe Biden has the popular centrist position. Just factually, look, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. By the way, 69% of Republicans, that's pretty damn good. 64% of Republicans want into Medicaid, only 26 oppose on both sides. It's pretty good for that position. And if you needed more proof that Biden is closer to the center of the country than is Bernie Sanders, just look, Medicare for all polling numbers versus the public option polling numbers. Public option does better in every category than does Medicare for all. You see, what most people that support Bernie Sanders or any of his programs actually want the media or pollsters to do is to lie and or skew the issues in favor of Bernie Sanders. How many times have you heard somebody on the far left say that Bernie Sanders has already explained how to pay for Medicare for all? That's just not the case. If you look at the forms that he gave Chris Cuomo on that CNN town hall live on air and you add up the numbers, you get to a number around $17.9 trillion. Nuance Bro did a great video where he literally goes through this line by line so you could see the math in action, and that's the number that he gets to. Now, when you have the low end estimate of Medicare for All coming in at $32 trillion over 10 years, you can't say that he already covered how to pay for it when he's only presented $17 trillion in new taxes. That's not how math works. But another thing people in the far left media want you to skew in favor of Bernie Sanders and the Medicare for All system is that low end number for Medicare for All, that $32 trillion number. They want you to only talk about that number in relation to the cost of private healthcare spending currently that we're dealing with right now. Because when you do that, that actually gives you an indication that Medicare for All overall, when all things are considered and added up together, will save people money, because $5 trillion a year is way more money than $3.2 trillion a year. Now, call me crazy, but when I hear that a new program overall is going to save the American people nearly $2 trillion a year, just like that, I want to know exactly where those savings come from. But the left never wants to talk about it. They just want to say, even the Koch brothers Mercatus Center study says Medicare for All is cheaper. Well, why don't we go to the author of a study, and credit to Stephen Michael Davis for digging up this clip, so he can explain to you where the savings in Medicare for All actually come from.
And there is a top-line projection in the study that would have national health expenditures going down, but it is predicated on several things, including those 40% provider payment cuts. Now, obviously, if you cut payments to providers by 40%, spending is going to go down. We don't know what else would happen. There might be access issues and quality issues and all sorts of things that might happen. We don't even know whether that's plausible. This is not 40% gradually over time, a la some of the changes in the Affordable Care Act. This is 40% immediately in the very first year. Whether that's plausible, I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. According to the Bernie Sanders bill as currently written, the trick to saving $2 trillion is just to pay everyone 60 cents on the dollar for services and cross your fingers and your toes and hope that paying people 60 cents on the dollar has no negative consequences for healthcare quality or access. Now, call me crazy, call me a radical, call me a conservative that hates poor people and wants to deny people healthcare, but I think it's a little absurd and maybe wishful thinking at best to think that all hospitals and providers can from one year to another just be totally fine making 60 cents on the dollar from the previous year for everything that they provide. I think that's a little bit not likely to happen. Look, it's fine to advocate for a position. It's fine to hire consultants and pollsters to test the language that will help you to sell that position better. But if you're trying to make the case that the American people overwhelmingly are on your side on every major issue, or even a single major issue, when the exact polling you're using to indicate their support actually indicates the opposite, I'm going to call you out on it. Because not only are you wrong on the issue, and worst case scenario, you're deliberately misrepresenting the issue, but there's also that chance that you actually buy into your hype, and that's when you get the meltdowns that have occurred post Super Tuesday and the rise of Joe Biden.
Even though, overwhelmingly, again, his policies are really popular. In fact, one of the most black-pilling things about Super Tuesday was this poll that came out. In all of the states, they agreed with Bernie's healthcare policy. Yet in most of those states, Biden won.
If you look at the Medicare for All polling, you can see the rise of somebody like Joe Biden being inevitable, specifically on people who value healthcare overall. However, people look at the data and they can't understand that most people just don't know what Medicare for All is. And when actually tested and when you actually delve into the numbers, the reality is that the majority of people in the Democratic Party prefer Joe Biden's position than Bernie Sanders' position. Again, just as in my previous video, if you go into the description box underneath the sources tab, I will link directly to all this information so that you can go over these charts yourself, read the summary. I'll also link that Market Watch article if you want a nice boil down of this information. Please check it out and reframe how you think about this issue if you've been taking in the skewed opinions and skewed representations of reality put forward by people like Kyle Kulinski. But those are my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. As always, if you like this video, please show me by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social medias. You can support me via one-time donation on Venmo or PayPal, monthly Patreon Subscribestar, or buy something from my Teespring store. This has been me once again showing the delusion of people like Kyle Kulinski. Till next time.